The courthouse steps were cold beneath me, even through my jeans. I watched officers in dress blues stride past their medals, catching the morning light like scattered stars. None of them looked at me twice. Plain clothes, plain face, plain woman waiting on concrete while history moved around her. They never told anyone I went to war. Not the neighbors who asked why I'd been gone so long. Not the friends who wondered what happened to that serious girl from college ROTC. Not even distant relatives at family barbecues who'd eye me sideways and whisper about potential that went nowhere. They just said I dropped out and drifted. My name is Morgan Reed. Oldest daughter, quiet one. The failure who left ROTC and never came back. That's what they say when people ask about me, which isn't often. I'm the cautionary tale in a family built on uniform and order. The one who couldn't handle the discipline. The disappointment who proved that not everyone Walsh blood runs military strong. What they don't know is I served 11 years. 5 of them classified so deep they don't officially exist. I bled for this country while my sister smiled for cameras and collected ribbons for ceremonies I'll never attend. I led men through firefights in places that don't appear on maps while my family told people I was finding myself somewhere out west. The courthouse doors opened again. More brass, more ceremony. A young lieutenant caught my eye for half a second before looking away. Standard civilian dismissal. I'm used to it by now. If you're still listening, maybe this sounds familiar. Maybe you've been the invisible one too. Maybe you know what it feels like to carry weight no one acknowledges, to bleed in silence, while others collect applause for lesser wounds. Maybe you understand that sometimes the deepest cuts come from the people who should know you best, but choose not to see. I'm here because my sister Lindsay is on trial. Not for anything dramatic. No treason, no war crimes. Just falsifying mission data on a humanitarian operation that went sideways. The kind of mistake that ruins careers and breaks trust, but quietly. The military way. They called me as a character witness. My mother's voice on the phone was brisk, businesslike. You should be here. You knew her growing up. Just don't say anything weird. Don't embarrass us. Don't make this about you. Don't remind anyone that you exist. I almost laughed. Character witness. As if I had any character left to witness after 28 years of being edited out of my own story. But I came anyway, not for them. Not for Lindsay, who built her career on the foundation of my supposed failure. I came because sometimes truth has gravity, and when it finally pulls everything into orbit, you want to be there to watch the pieces find their proper places. The leather bracelet on my wrist caught on my sleeve as I shifted. Dark brown, worn smooth, made by small hands in a place where children shouldn't have to make anything for soldiers. A girl named Amara, maybe 8 years old, who pressed it into my palm after we pulled her family from a collapsed building in Damascus, 3 days before a secondary strike took out half the block. I still wear it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that some things matter more than being seen. The courthouse steps were filling up now. Officers, family members, journalists with notepads and tired expressions. A military trial draws a particular crowd. People who understand that justice in uniform moves differently than civilian justice. Slower, more careful, with more attention to precedent and protocol. I recognized a few faces from old briefings, former colleagues who'd nod politely if they remembered me at all. Which they wouldn't. That was the point of what I did, what I was. The kind of soldier who succeeds by disappearing. My phone buzzed. A text from my father, sitting with your mother in the second row. There's space if you want to join the family. The family, as if I'd ever been allowed to claim that word without qualification. I typed back, I'm fine where I am, and I was. Fine with the distance. Fine with the concrete and the cold. Fine with watching from the edges while my sister faced consequences for choices I could have helped her avoid if anyone had bothered to ask what I might know about leading under pressure. The doors opened one final time before the session began. A stream of dress blues, morning light catching on polished brass and perfect posture. I watched them file in to judge my sister's failure while sitting 20 feet from a woman who'd succeeded in ways they'd never know. Sometimes the best revenge is just being present when the truth decides to speak. I stood up, brushed off my jeans, and followed them inside. The courtroom was filling, but my mind drifted backward to where this all began. 23 years old, standing in the ROTC office at State, staring at papers that would change everything. I'd been 3 months from graduation. Top of my class in tactical strategy, second in marksmanship, first in leadership evaluations. My instructor, Colonel Hayes, had already written my recommendation for active duty. The Army wanted me. I wanted the Army. Everything was lined up like dominoes, ready to fall in perfect military order. Then Hayes called me in after morning drills. "Reed, you're being transferred. Not graduated. Transferred." To a program that didn't have a name, just a classification level that made him lower his voice when he said it. "Your family will be told you left the program. Medical discharge. They won't ask questions." What if they do? They won't. He was right. They didn't. 2 days later, I was gone. No ceremony, no goodbye formation, no final inspection. Just a plane ticket to Virginia and instructions to tell no one where I was going. My parents got a form letter explaining that I'd been medically separated due to stress-related issues, failure to adapt to military structure. Lindsay called me that night, voice bright with false sympathy. "It's okay, Morgan. Not everyone's cut out for it. You can try again later." I hung up without answering. The training facility in Virginia had no windows and no name on the building directory. For 6 months, I learned to disappear, how to move through cities without leaving digital footprints, how to blend into civilian populations, how to kill quietly and quickly when blending wasn't enough. My classmates were ghosts like me. Former special forces who'd been pulled from their unit's intelligence officers who'd shown aptitude for deep cover linguists, who could think like locals instead of tourists. We didn't use real names. I was Denver for those 6 months, named after the first city I'd ever felt invisible in. After graduation, if you could call it that, they gave me back my name and sent me to Afghanistan. Not the Afghanistan you see on the news with bases and mess halls and regular communication home. The other Afghanistan. The one that exists in the spaces between official operations. I spent 2 years moving through villages that barely existed on maps, coordinating with local networks, gathering intelligence that never made it into Pentagon briefings. Sometimes I'd go weeks without speaking English. When I did get messages from home, they were forwarded through so many relays that my mother's voice on recorded voicemails sounded like she was calling from another planet. Yemen was harder, the heat, the politics, the way trust could evaporate between sunrise and sunset. I learned Arabic from a former professor who'd been recruited the same way I had, pulled from his ordinary life and given extraordinary purpose. He taught me that language isn't just words, it's the rhythm of belonging. By the end of my rotation, I could argue prices in Sana'a markets and sound like I'd been born there. The bracelet came from a girl named Sarah in Damascus. She couldn't have been older than 8 dark eyes, too serious for her age. I'd been part of a humanitarian extraction. 22 civilians trapped in a building that had taken indirect fire. We had maybe 30 minutes before the area became too hot to operate in. Sarah was the last one out. When I lifted her over the rubble pile, she pressed the bracelet into my palm. Rough leather, simple knots, made from what looked like a piece of shoe strap. She said something in Arabic that my translator later told me meant, "So you remember." 3 days later, a secondary strike leveled the entire block. Sarah's family had been relocated to a safe zone, but the building where I'd found her was gone, erased, like it had never existed. I still wear her bracelet, not because I need to remember the mission, but because I need to remember that some things matter more than being acknowledged. While I was learning to navigate war zones, Lindsay was learning to navigate photo opportunities. Her Instagram was a carefully curated collection of training exercises and promotion ceremonies. Every post got hundreds of likes, dozens of comments calling her a hero, an inspiration, a role model for young women in military service. My parents shared every single one. I remember the barbecue. I'd been back stateside for exactly 3 days, still adjusting to the sensation of not checking exits every time I entered a room. Lindsay was home on leave, fresh from officer candidate school, wearing her dress blues like they were designer clothes. The neighbors gathered around her like she was holding court. War stories that weren't really war stories. Training mishaps and drill instructor humor. The kind of military experience that translates well to civilian dinner parties. Safe stories. Comfortable stories. Someone asked about me, where I'd been, what I was doing. My father answered without looking at me. Morgan, she couldn't follow orders. Dropped out of ROTC, been drifting ever since. Some people just aren't built for structure. The words hit like sniper fire. Clean, precise, devastating. I excused myself and walked to the edge of the yard, where the fence line met the woods. Behind me, laughter bubbled up from the patio. Lindsay's voice carried over the others, confident and clear, telling another story about military life to people who'd never understand what military life actually meant. I touched the bracelet on my wrist and thought about Sarah, about trust and sacrifice and the weight of carrying other people's lives in your hands, about the difference between serving your country and serving your image. When I turned back toward the house, my reflection caught in the sliding glass door. For just a moment, I looked like a stranger, someone who'd learned to disappear so completely that even she couldn't quite believe she was still there. That was the day I stopped expecting them to see me. It was also the day I realized that being invisible might be the most powerful thing I'd ever learned to do. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing intelligence briefs in my apartment outside DC. 3 months of quiet consulting work, the kind that pays well and asks few questions. I'd been deep in analysis of supply chain vulnerabilities in Eastern Europe when my phone buzzed with a number I recognized but rarely answered. My mother's contact photo filled the screen. A formal portrait from my father's retirement ceremony, her smile precise and camera ready. I let it ring twice before picking up. Morgan, not "Hi, sweetheart," or "How are you, honey?" Just my name spoken like a military call sign. Efficient, direct. The way she'd learned to communicate during her years as a combat medic when wasted words could mean wasted lives. Lindsay's on trial. You should be here. You might be a character witness. No preamble. No explanation of what the trial was about or why they'd need me or how long it had been since we'd spoken. Just facts delivered in the tone she used for medical reports. "What's the charge?" I asked, setting down my coffee and closing the intelligence file. Falsifying mission data. Humanitarian operation in Syria went sideways. 3 civilians injured, 1 critical. She signed off on reports that didn't match what actually happened on the ground. Syria. The word hit me like cold water. I'd been in Syria more times than I could count, knew the terrain like a hometown street map. Knew how humanitarian missions could turn deadly in the space between one radio check and the next. When's the trial? Next week, Fort Campbell. The prosecution is painting her as reckless, says she prioritized mission completion over civilian safety. We need people who can speak to her character. Character witness. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted me to vouch for the character of someone who'd spent years convinced I had none. What makes you think I'd be helpful? A pause. Long enough that I could hear my father's voice in the background, muffled but insistent. Some kind of strategic discussion happening in real time. You knew her growing up. You understand military pressure. And another pause, this one heavier. And you won't make this about yourself. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not because they wanted my help, but because they needed my silence. They needed someone who'd learned to be invisible, who wouldn't steal focus from Lindsay's story or complicate the narrative they were trying to build. They needed a prop, not a witness. "Have you read the mission reports?" I asked. "That's classified. You don't have clearance for pop." Mother. I used the tone I'd perfected in briefing rooms when junior analysts tried to explain my job to me. "I have clearance for things that would give you nightmares. The question is whether you want my help or my compliance." Silence stretched between us. In the background, I could hear the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in our house for as long as I could remember. It was the same clock that had counted down my childhood, measured the years I'd been gone, and now tracked the seconds of this conversation that neither of us really wanted to have. "The reports are sealed pending trial outcome," she said finally. "What I can tell you is that Lindsay was the commanding officer on a medical evacuation. Building collapse, multiple casualties. She had to make quick decisions under fire. And the investigation suggests she may have adjusted the timeline in her after-action report, made it seem like the civilian casualties were unavoidable when they might have been preventable." I leaned back in my chair, staring out my window at the Potomac. Somewhere across that water in Pentagon, briefing rooms and NSA facilities, people were making the same kinds of impossible choices Lindsay had faced. The difference was some of us had learned to live with the weight of those decisions. Others tried to rearrange the facts to make the weight more bearable. "She's scared," my mother continued. "This could end her career. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possible jail time. We just need people who can testify that she's fundamentally a good officer who made a mistake under pressure. A good officer. I wondered if they'd ever describe me that way, even in private. Probably not. Good officers got commendations and promotions and family barbecues in their honor. They didn't disappear into classified programs and spend years being erased from Christmas card photos. Will you come? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. I could say no. Should say no. I had my own life now, my own work, my own carefully constructed peace. That didn't include family dynamics or the weight of other people's expectations, but Syria. Humanitarian evacuations. The impossible mathematics of saving some lives while losing others. I knew that math better than anyone in that courtroom would. I'd done those calculations in real time with bullets flying and buildings burning and seconds to decide who lived and who didn't. I'll be there, I said. Good. Don't wear anything dramatic. And maybe don't mention your work. People don't need to know about whatever it is you do now. Whatever it is you do. As if my 11 years of service were a hobby I'd picked up between unemployment checks. Understood. Thank you, Morgan. This means I hung up before she could finish, not out of anger but out of necessity. I didn't need to hear what this meant to them. I already knew. It meant I was useful again, if only temporarily. It meant they remembered I existed, if only because they needed something from me. I sat in my apartment for an hour after the call ended, watching the river and thinking about Lindsay. About the weight of command and the stories we tell ourselves when the weight becomes too much. About the difference between making hard choices and rewriting history to make those choices easier to live with. Then I opened my laptop and booked a flight to Nashville. Not because I wanted to save my sister, because I wanted to understand what she'd thought was worth lying about. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Same brick facade, same manicured lawn, same American flag hanging from the porch post at regulation angle, but somehow diminished like a photograph that had been cropped too tightly. I parked behind my father's truck and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the front window, I could see movement in the kitchen. My mother's silhouette, sharp and efficient, moving between counter and stove with the precision of someone who'd learned to work under pressure. Behind her, the dining room table was set for 6. Company was coming. I grabbed my overnight bag from the passenger seat and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. Military families in military neighborhoods rarely bothered with locks during daylight hours. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer that had once felt like home and now felt like a museum of someone else's childhood. Morgan. My mother's voice carried from the kitchen. We're in here. The hallway was lined with photographs just like I remembered, but they told a different story now. Lindsay's graduation from basic training. Lindsay receiving her commission. Lindsay shaking hands with a congressman at some award ceremony. My father's retirement photo. My mother in dress blues from her promotion to sergeant major. I was in exactly 3 frames. My high school graduation photo, faded and pushed to the far end near the bathroom. A family Christmas picture from 2009 before I'd been recruited, where I stood slightly apart from the group like I was already disappearing. And one shot from my ROTC days, me in uniform at some forgotten ceremony, looking serious and hopeful and young. After that, the wall documented a family of 4, not 5. Where should I put my bag? I called out. Silence from the kitchen, then my mother appeared in the doorway, dish towel in her hands. Oh, right. Your room we converted it. There's an air mattress in the basement guest area. It's comfortable enough. My room. The space where I'd done homework and planned my future and dreamed about serving my country. Now it was storage for Christmas decorations and exercise equipment that nobody used. That's fine, I said, because it was easier than explaining why it wasn't. I carried my bag downstairs to what used to be my father's workshop. The air mattress was already inflated, pushed against the far wall between a treadmill and boxes labeled Lindsay's college stuff, in my mother's precise handwriting. A folded towel and washcloth sat on top of a pillow that smelled like mothballs. This was where they'd put me. In the basement, surrounded by the archived memories of their other children sleeping on borrowed air. I unpacked quickly and headed back upstairs. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and anxiety. My mother was checking her watch. My father was polishing his dress shoes at the kitchen table, and Lindsay sat at the breakfast bar, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity of someone trying to avoid eye contact. She looked older than her 26 years. Stress had carved lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun so tight, it seemed to be holding her whole face in place. "Hey," I said. She glanced up, managed a weak smile. "Hey yourself. Thanks for coming." "Of course." An awkward pause filled the space between us. We used to be close before the army, before the secrets, before she became the golden child, and I became the cautionary tale. Now we were strangers sharing DNA and a common enemy in the form of her upcoming trial. The doorbell rang, saving us from further conversation. "That'll be the Hendersons," my mother said, smoothing her hair. "And Colonel Martinez from Lindsay's unit. They wanted to meet before the trial." Company dinner, I should have known. My family didn't do anything without an audience when Lindsay's career was involved. The Hendersons were neighbors who'd known us since we were kids. Tom Henderson had served in the Navy, retired now, but still carried himself like an officer. His wife Beth taught school and had the kind of warm smile that made you want to confess your secrets. Colonel Martinez was Lindsay's commanding officer, a compact woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. We gathered around the dining room table that my mother had set with her good china. The conversation flowed like water around rocks, finding the easiest path and avoiding obstacles. "Lindsay, tell them about your commendation last year," my mother prompted, passing the rolls. And Lindsay did. The story of her unit's humanitarian mission in Jordan, how they'd delivered medical supplies to refugee camps under difficult conditions. Her voice gained strength as she talked, the confidence returning that had made her such a natural leader. 30,000 people got clean water because of your logistics coordination, Colonel Martinez added. "That's the kind of officer we're dealing with here, someone who puts mission and people first." The conversation continued like a highlights reel. Lindsay's promotion to captain, her selection for advanced officer training, her volunteer work with military families. Each achievement polished and presented like evidence in a character trial that was happening around our dinner table. I ate quietly, occasionally nodding when someone looked my way, but mostly just observing. This was how my family worked now. Everything centered around Lindsay's orbit, with the rest of us reflecting her light. "And what about you, Morgan?" Beth Henderson asked during a lull in the testimonials. "What are you up to these days?" 6 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I could feel my mother's tension across the table, the subtle shake of her head that meant, "Don't complicate things." "I work in consulting," I said. "Analysis and strategic planning." "Oh, that's nice." Beth's smile was genuine but vague. "Government work." "Something like that," my father cleared his throat. Morgan did some admin work after she left ROTC. VA stuff, I think. Nothing too exciting. VA stuff. Admin work. Nothing too exciting. I took a sip of water and tasted bitterness that had nothing to do with the meal. "Well, that's important work too," Colonel Martinez said diplomatically. "The military needs good support staff." Support staff? I almost laughed. If she only knew that I'd probably briefed people 3 levels above her pay grade, that I'd made strategic recommendations that had shaped policy decisions she'd never even hear about. But that was the point, wasn't it? The work I did was designed to be invisible. The problem was I'd become invisible too. The dinner continued for another hour. More stories about Lindsay's accomplishments, more reassurances about the trial, more careful navigation around the topic of what had actually happened in Syria. I contributed when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and felt myself shrinking into the same small space I'd occupied in this house for years. After the guests left, I helped clear the table, while my parents and Lindsay discussed trial strategy in the living room. Their voices carried into the kitchen, concerns about media coverage, witness preparation, the political implications of a high-profile court-martial. "She'll be fine," I heard my father say. "Good family, good record, good character witnesses. The truth will come out, the truth." I wondered which version of the truth they were planning to present. The one where Lindsay was a dedicated officer who'd made an honest mistake under pressure, or the one where she'd falsified reports to cover up a decision that had gotten people hurt. I finished loading the dishwasher and headed toward the basement. As I passed the living room, Lindsay looked up from her legal papers. "Morgan, thanks again for being here." "We're family," I said. Because that's what you're supposed to say even when family feels like a group of strangers who happen to share a last name. Downstairs, I lay on the air mattress staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Above my head, I could hear my family's voices discussing strategy and damage control, planning how to save Lindsay's career without mentioning that they had a daughter who might actually understand what she'd been going through. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I Googled my own name. The search results were clean, professional, boring, a few mentions in consulting trade publications, a LinkedIn profile that revealed nothing important. No military service record, no classified operations, no evidence that Morgan Reed had ever done anything more significant than push papers around a government office. It was exactly what it was supposed to be, a perfect cover story. But lying there in my childhood basement surrounded by boxes of my sister's memories, while sleeping on borrowed air, I realized that sometime along the way, the cover story had become my whole story. At least as far as my family was concerned. I was the ghost who'd learned to disappear so completely that even the people who'd made me had forgotten I was real. Tomorrow I'd sit in a courtroom and watch my sister face consequences for choices I understood better than anyone. And afterward I'd disappear again, back to my quiet apartment and my classified work, and my carefully constructed invisibility. But tonight I just lay in the dark and wondered what it would feel like to be seen. The courtroom at Fort Campbell felt like a church built for judgment instead of salvation. High ceilings, polished wood, and an American flag that hung perfectly still in the climate-controlled air. I took a seat in the back row of the public gallery, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to remain invisible. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the floor where lawyers shuffled papers and officers checked their phones one last time before proceedings began. I watched my family file into the second row, my parents flanking Lindsay like bookends, their faces set in expressions of quiet determination. They hadn't saved me a seat, hadn't even looked back to see if I was there. The gallery filled slowly with the kind of people who attend military trials, fellow officers showing support journalists with notepads, and family members whose lives had been upended by the machinery of military justice. I recognized a few faces from Lindsay's unit young Marines, who kept glancing at their phones and whispering among themselves. Nobody looked at me twice. Plain clothes, plain face, just another civilian observer in a room full of uniforms and important people. The bailiff called us to attention as Judge Colonel Patricia Wells entered. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that made even seasoned officers straighten their spines. Behind her came the court reporter and the military prosecutor, Major David Chang, who looked like he'd been born wearing dress blues. "Be seated," Colonel Wells said. "This court-martial will come to order." The charges were read with military precision: Article 86, absence without leave; Article 92, failure to obey order or regulation; Article 134, general article for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The words hung in the air like accusations written in smoke. But it was the details that mattered. The humanitarian mission in Aleppo, the building collapse that had trapped civilians, the impossible choice between evacuating the wounded and securing the area, and the after-action report that had somehow rearranged the timeline to make Lindsay's decisions look more defensible than they'd actually been. I listened to Major Chung outline the prosecution's case with the kind of detached interest I'd learned in briefing rooms, facts presented cleanly without emotion, building toward a conclusion that felt inevitable. Lindsay had falsified official documents. People had been hurt. Trust had been broken. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say without classified briefings, was how impossible those decisions were in real time. How the difference between saving lives and losing them could come down to seconds and guesswork, and the kind of moral calculations that would haunt you for years afterward. I'd made those calculations myself, in Damascus, in Kandahar, in places that didn't exist on any official map. The difference was, I'd learned to live with the weight instead of trying to redistribute it. Lindsay sat at the defense table with perfect posture, hands folded, eyes forward. She looked like what she was, a competent officer who'd made a mistake and gotten caught. Her lawyer, Captain Rebecca Torres, whispered something in her ear that made her nod slightly. The morning proceeded with opening statements and preliminary witnesses. A medical officer who'd treated the civilian casualties, an intelligence analyst who'd reviewed the mission parameters, a logistics coordinator who testified about resource allocation and timing, standard testimony, professional voices describing a situation that had gone wrong in predictable ways. Nothing dramatic, nothing surprising. Just the slow accumulation of facts that would determine whether my sister's career ended in disgrace or survived with damage. I was checking my watch when Judge Wells called for the next witness, and something shifted in the courtroom's energy. A ripple of recognition, heads turning, whispered conversations that stopped mid-sentence. Colonel James Morrison entered through the side door. I knew him by reputation, a decorated Marine officer who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, someone whose opinions carried weight in military circles. What I didn't expect was the way his eyes swept the gallery and locked onto mine. His expression changed. Surprise, then recognition, then something that looked like respect. He took the witness stand and was sworn in with the usual formalities. Major Chung began his questioning about protocol and standard operating procedures for humanitarian missions. Morrison answered with crisp professionalism, outlining the expectations for commanding officers in combat zones. Then Judge Wells interrupted. "Excuse me, Colonel Morrison, but before we continue..." She was looking past the witness stand, scanning the gallery with the kind of systematic attention that missed nothing. Her gaze stopped on me. "Wait." Her voice carried across the courtroom like a rifle shot. "You're Morgan Reed." The room went absolutely silent. Not just quiet. Silent in the way that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. I felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward me. My mother's face went pale. My father's mouth opened slightly. Lindsay twisted in her chair to stare at me with an expression I couldn't read. Judge Wells stood up in the middle of proceedings, and faced me directly. Then she saluted. Sharp, precise, held longer than regulation required. Colonel Morrison followed suit from the witness stand. One by one, every uniformed officer in the courtroom rose and saluted. The bailiff, the court reporter, even Major Chung, the prosecutor, stood and rendered honors. The whispers started low and built like a storm. "Is that her? The Morgan Reed? I thought she was dead. Operation Nightfall, she was the one who... Jesus Christ, that's the ghost mother." My mother's eyes flickered between confusion and something that looked like panic. She leaned toward my father, who was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. Which in a way he was. Lindsay's face had gone completely white. I stood slowly and returned the salute, not because I wanted the attention, but because 30 years of training had made the response automatic. The weight of recognition settled on my shoulders like a uniform I'd forgotten I was wearing. Judge Wells remained standing until I lowered my hand. Then she sat down heavily, as if the revelation had knocked something loose inside her chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden stillness, "we appear to have an unusual situation. Colonel Morrison, are you acquainted with Miss Reed?" Morrison's voice was steady but respectful. "Ma'am, I had the honor of serving under General Reed's command during Operation Sandstorm in 2018. She saved my entire unit." General Reed. The title hung in the air like an explosion's echo. I saw my mother grip the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles went white. My father's mouth moved silently, like he was trying to say something, but had forgotten how words worked. And Lindsay. Lindsay was staring at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized the person sitting behind her wasn't who she thought they were. Had never been who she thought they were. Judge Wells cleared her throat. "General Reed, would you be willing to make yourself available as a potential witness in these proceedings, given your expertise in humanitarian operations under combat conditions?" The question echoed in the silence. Every person in that courtroom was waiting for my answer. My family. The officers who'd just saluted me. The journalists whose pens were frozen above their notepads. I looked at Lindsay. At my sister, who'd spent years believing she was the military success story in our family. Who'd built her identity on being the one who'd succeeded where I had failed. Who was about to learn that everything she'd believed about me, about herself, about our family's story, had been a carefully constructed lie. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I'll be available." The gavel came down like thunder. The courtroom had recessed, but I couldn't move from my seat. The whispers continued around me like static electricity fragments of conversations about missions and classifications and a woman they thought they knew. I touched the leather bracelet on my wrist and let my mind drift back to the operation that had earned me a reputation I'd never wanted. Damascus, 2019. 3 days before Christmas, though. Christmas didn't mean much in a city where the sound of artillery had become as common as morning prayer calls. The intelligence had come through encrypted channels at 0400 hours. A residential building in the Jobar district had taken indirect fire during a skirmish between government forces and rebel fighters. The structure was compromised but hadn't collapsed completely. Satellite imagery showed heat signatures, civilians trapped in the wreckage, including what appeared to be multiple children. The mission parameters were simple on paper. Extract civilians, provide immediate medical aid, evacuate to safe zone. In reality, nothing about Damascus was simple. The area was contested territory, meaning nobody controlled it completely, and everybody shot at anyone who moved through it uninvited. I'd been running a small tactical unit, 7 specialists handpicked for urban operations in hostile territory. We called ourselves the cleanup crew. Though the official designation was so classified, it changed every few months. Our job was to handle the situations that fell between the cracks of official military policy. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres was my second in command, a medic from El Paso, who could intubate a patient while bullets flew overhead. Corporal Jennifer Walsh, no relation to my family despite the name, was our communications specialist and the best urban navigator I'd ever worked with. The others were specialists in demolitions linguistics and what the Army politely called threat neutralization. We'd worked together for 18 months by then, long enough to communicate without radios, to trust each other's judgment without question, to know that when things went wrong, and they always went wrong, we'd bring everyone home or die trying. The insertion was clean. 2 vehicles, civilian plates, arriving separately at the perimeter of the collapse zone. The building was a 4-story residential structure that had been home to maybe 40 families before the war turned their neighborhood into a shooting gallery. Now it looked like a broken tooth, the top 2 floors sheared away, and the remaining structure listing at an angle that suggested it could finish collapsing at any moment. Ghost Mother, this is Torres. Heat signatures confirmed on thermal. Multiple civilians trapped in the basement level, at least 6 children. Access route looks clear but unstable. Ghost Mother. The call sign had started as a joke. Someone said I moved through hostile territory like a ghost and protected my team like a mother protecting her children. But the name had stuck and spread through the intelligence community until even officers who'd never met me knew who I was. I studied the building through binoculars, calculating angles and weight distribution and the probability that our extraction would bring the whole structure down. The mathematics of life and death reduced to engineering principles and educated guesswork. Time constraint, I asked. Local forces are 30 minutes out, maybe less. Government patrol spotted our vehicles. They won't wait for explanations. 30 minutes to get inside, locate the civilians, provide medical aid, and extract 20-plus people from a building that might collapse if someone sneezed too hard, in a neighborhood where the sound of our operation would draw fire from 3 different directions. We go in, I decided. Torres, you and Walsh take point. I'll coordinate from the breach point. Remember, we don't leave anyone behind, but we don't die for anyone either. That was the rule I'd learned in training and refined through experience. Save who you can, but don't add to the casualty count by taking unnecessary risks. It sounded rational in briefing rooms. In the field with children crying somewhere in the dark, beneath tons of concrete and twisted rebar, rationality became more complicated. The extraction took 19 minutes. 19 minutes of controlled chaos, of moving through spaces that groaned and shifted with every step, of using hand signals and whispered commands to coordinate a rescue that had no backup plan and no margin for error. We found them in what had been the building's basement storage area, 22 civilians huddled around a support beam that was the only thing keeping several tons of debris from crushing them. Adults, elderly children, ranging from infants to teenagers. All scared, some injured, none dead. Yet, the youngest was a girl, maybe 3 years old, clutching a stuffed animal that had been white before the dust and blood. She looked at me with dark eyes that were too serious for her age and said something in Arabic that I didn't need Torres to translate. Help us. We moved them out in groups, the wounded first, then the elderly, then the children. Each trip through the unstable structure was a gamble that the building would hold for just a few more minutes. Each person we carried to safety was one less heat signature on our thermal scans. The little girl was in the last group. She held onto my hand as we navigated the debris field, her small fingers gripping mine with the desperate strength of someone who understood that letting go meant being lost forever. "What's your name?" I asked in Arabic. "Layla," she whispered. "Are you an angel?" I almost smiled. "No, sweetheart. Just a soldier." We got them all out. 22 civilians extracted from a death trap with minutes to spare before the local patrol arrived and started asking questions we couldn't answer. No casualties, no international incidents, no evidence that American forces had ever been in the area. The building collapsed 6 hours later. My team called it a perfect mission. Clean insertion, successful extraction, 0 American casualties, minimal exposure. The kind of operation that earned quiet commendations and classified citations and absolutely no public recognition. Torres submitted me for a medal. It was declined for operational security reasons. The official after-action report was one line in a classified intelligence brief. Civilian rescue operation in Damascus sector completed successfully. No further action required. That was it. 22 lives saved, reduced to a bureaucratic footnote that maybe a dozen people would ever read. But we'd done our job. We'd brought everyone home. Except 3 weeks later, I learned that Layla had died in an unrelated airstrike while staying with relatives in Aleppo. A precision munition had hit the building where her extended family was sheltering. No survivors. The little girl who'd asked if I was an angel, who'd held my hand while we walked through hell together, who'd survived a building collapse and a military extraction, had been killed by the same war I was supposedly fighting to protect people like her. That was when I understood that trauma isn't just the wound itself. It's being told that the wound never happened. It's carrying the weight of lives saved and lives lost, while the world pretends you were never there. It's knowing that somewhere in a classified file, Layla's death is reduced to numbers and coordinates and strategic assessments that don't include the fact that she used to draw pictures of flowers in the dust while she waited for her mother to find food. I never got that medal, never got the recognition, never got to tell anyone outside my unit about the 22 people who went home to their families because we'd been willing to risk our lives in a collapsing building in a war that officially didn't involve us. But for 19 minutes in Damascus, I'd been exactly who I was trained to be. A ghost who could move through darkness, a mother who could protect the innocent, a soldier who understood that some missions matter more than the medals they'll never earn you. I touched the leather bracelet again and returned to the present, to a courtroom where my sister was on trial for falsifying reports about a humanitarian mission gone wrong. Sometimes the weight of what we carry is heavier than the weight of what we've lost. But at least in that courtroom, for the first time in years, someone was finally acknowledging that I'd been carrying anything at all. The lunch recess gave me time to think, which was dangerous. I walked the perimeter of Fort Campbell's main quad, letting muscle memory guide my feet, while my mind processed what had just happened in that courtroom. Recognition, salutes, my cover blown in the most public way possible. But something else was bothering me. Something about the timeline of Lindsay's charges, the specific language in the prosecution's case, the way certain details had been phrased in Major Chang's opening statement. I pulled out my phone and made a call to a number that most people didn't know existed. "Mitchell here. It's Morgan. I need you to run something for me." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell was one of the few people who knew both my real service record and my current consulting work. She'd been my intelligence liaison during Operation Sandstorm, and she owed me a favor that we'd never had to call in. Until now. "What do you need?" Cross-reference the prosecution files in United States vs. Captain Lindsay Reed, case number CM 2024-1147, with any flagged reports or investigations filed under my name in the past 5 years. Look for overlapping language, similar accusations, metadata trails. A pause. "That's a weird request, Morgan. You thinking there's a connection?" "I'm thinking the timing is suspicious. Can you run it or not? Give me 20 minutes. I spent those 20 minutes sitting on a bench near the PX, watching junior enlisted personnel hurry between buildings and trying to ignore the looks I was getting from officers who'd been in that courtroom. Word travels fast on military installations, and by now, half the base probably knew that the woman they dismissed as Lindsay Reed's civilian sister was actually someone with enough clearance to make colonels stand at attention. My phone buzzed. "You're not going to like this," Mitchell said, without preamble. "Tell me." 3 years ago, someone filed an anonymous report alleging that a classified operative codenamed Ghost Mother had exceeded operational parameters during a humanitarian mission in Syria. The report claimed unnecessary risks were taken, civilian casualties could have been prevented, and that the operative's emotional attachment to rescue operations was compromising mission effectiveness. My blood went cold. What was the outcome? Investigation was opened, then closed within 48 hours when your commanding officer testified that the allegations were completely unfounded. The report was classified as malicious and filed away. But here's the interesting part. The language in that anonymous report matches almost word for word some of the accusations being leveled at your sister. Metadata. That's where it gets complicated. The original report was filed through a secure military terminal at Fort Campbell. The IP address traces back to a workstation in the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit's administrative offices. Lindsay's unit. There's more, Mitchell continued. I pulled the investigation files from your sister's current case. Someone provided the prosecution with background intelligence about humanitarian operations in Syria, including classified details about operational procedures that only someone with access to Marine Corps intelligence databases would know. I closed my eyes. Who provided the intelligence? The source is listed as an anonymous military whistleblower, but the digital fingerprints on the files show they were compiled on the same workstation that filed the original report against you. The pieces clicked into place like a rifle bolt sliding home. Lindsay hadn't just falsified her mission reports. She'd tried to destroy my career 3 years ago, and when that failed, she'd used the same playbook to cover up her own mistakes. Send me everything, I said. Morgan, this is your sister we're talking about. Send me everything. I found Lindsay in the courthouse parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine running and the air conditioning on high. She was staring at her phone, probably reading the news coverage that was already starting to appear online. Mystery General appears at military trial. Ghost soldier emerges from shadows. I knocked on her passenger window. She looked up, saw me, and her face went through a series of expressions that ended in resignation. She unlocked the door. I slid into the passenger seat and closed the door. For a moment, we just sat there in the climate-controlled silence, 2 sisters who'd become strangers sharing space in a car outside a courthouse where one of us was on trial. You filed that report, I said. Not a question. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Which report? The anonymous complaint about Ghost Mother. 3 years ago. You tried to get me investigated for misconduct on the Syria operation. Lindsay's breathing changed. Shorter, shallower. The kind of breathing pattern you develop when you're trying not to panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Lindsay. I used the tone I'd perfected in interrogation rooms, calm and patient and absolutely relentless. The metadata traces back to your workstation. The language in your trial files matches the language in the original complaint. You used classified information from my service record to build your case against me, and then you used the same information to try to cover up your own mistakes. She turned off the engine. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of other cars in the parking lot and the distant noise of an aircraft taking off from the base's airfield. Why? I asked. She stared through the windshield at the courthouse. Because you left. I didn't leave. I was recruited. You left us. Her voice was small, younger than her 26 years. You left, and they never stopped talking about you, even when you were gone, even when I was doing everything right, following every rule, earning every commendation they said you should have earned. I waited. Do you know what it's like, she continued, to spend your entire career being compared to someone who doesn't officially exist, to have superior officers make comments about how tactical innovation runs in the Reed family, to have people ask if I'm related to the Morgan Reed, and then watch their faces change when I say yes. I never asked for that. But you got it anyway. She turned to look at me, and I saw tears she was trying not to shed. I did everything right. Perfect grades, perfect fitness scores, perfect conduct record. I followed every regulation, completed every mission, made every promotion milestone. But I was never the one they talked about in the hallways. So you tried to destroy me. I tried to make it fair. Her voice cracked. I thought if I could prove that the great Morgan Reed wasn't perfect, that she'd made mistakes too, then maybe my accomplishments would matter. Maybe I could be seen as something other than the sister who stayed when the genius left. The weight of her confession settled between us like a physical presence. 3 years of investigation anxiety, of wondering if my career would survive an anonymous accusation, of questioning my own judgment on a mission where I'd saved 22 lives. All because my little sister couldn't stand living in the shadow of someone who was supposed to be invisible. And the falsified reports, I asked. Your current charges. I panicked. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The Syria mission went wrong. People got hurt because I made a bad call under pressure, so I adjusted the timeline. Made it look like the casualties were unavoidable instead of the result of my inexperience. Using the same tactics you'd tried to use against me, she nodded. I sat back in the passenger seat and stared at the courthouse, where in a few hours I'd be called to testify in my sister's trial, where I'd have to decide whether to tell the truth about her character or protect the family that had spent years pretending I didn't exist. I never wanted to be your competition, I said finally. But you were. She started the engine again. You were, and I never figured out how to stop fighting a war you didn't even know we were in. The air conditioning kicked in, cooling the space between us, but not the tension. Outside officers in dress blues walked toward the courthouse for the afternoon session. What happens now? She asked. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw not the confident Marine officer she presented to the world, but the scared little girl who used to follow me around the house, desperate for attention from parents who measured love in achievements and approval in rank insignia. Now, I said, we find out what the truth is actually worth. I got out of the car and walked back toward the courthouse, leaving her to decide whether she was ready to face the consequences of a war she'd started against a ghost who'd finally decided to stop being invisible. The afternoon session began with a different energy. Word had spread through the courthouse about the morning's revelation, and the gallery was fuller, now packed with officers who'd come to see the ghost mother testify. I felt their eyes on me as I walked down the aisle, but their attention felt different than the dismissive glances from the morning. This was recognition, acknowledgement. It should have felt good. It didn't. The court calls General Morgan Reed to the witness stand. I stood and walked forward past my family's row. My mother's face was pale, my father's expression unreadable. Lindsay wouldn't look at me at all. The bailiff swore me in with the usual formalities. I raised my right hand and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. After 11 years of classified service, the irony wasn't lost on me. Judge Wells looked at me with something that might have been respect or might have been curiosity. General Reed, for the record, would you please state your full name and current position? Morgan Elizabeth Reed. I currently work as an independent strategic consultant for various government agencies. My military service record is classified at the highest levels. And your relationship to the defendant, Captain Lindsay Reed, is my younger sister. Major Chang stood to begin his questioning. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of precise manner that suggested he'd spent more time in law libraries than on battlefields. General Reed, are you familiar with the operational parameters for humanitarian missions in contested territory? Yes. And in your professional opinion, what are the primary considerations a commanding officer must balance during such operations? I looked at Lindsay, who was staring at her hands. Speed versus safety. Mission completion versus acceptable risk. The immediate tactical situation versus long-term strategic implications. And above all, the weight of decisions that have to be made with incomplete information under extreme pressure. You testified that your military record is classified. Can you speak generally about your experience with humanitarian operations? I've commanded or participated in 17 humanitarian extractions in hostile territory over the past decade. Damascus, Kandahar, Mosul, and other locations I cannot name publicly. I've evacuated approximately 300 civilians from combat zones. A ripple went through the gallery. 300 lives. The number hung in the air like an indictment of everyone who'd ever dismissed me as a failure. In your experience, how common are split-second decisions that result in civilian casualties? Common enough that we train for them specifically. Uncommon enough that they haunt you for the rest of your career. Major Chang nodded and consulted his notes. General Reed, I'm going to ask you about the specific mission parameters that Captain Reed faced in Syria. Based on your review of the classified briefing materials, was she operating within standard protocols? I paused. This was the moment where I could either protect my sister or tell the truth, where family loyalty would collide with professional integrity, and something would have to give. Captain Reed was operating under protocols designed for experienced field commanders with extensive urban combat experience. The mission she was assigned required judgment that typically comes after years of similar operations. Are you saying she was underqualified for the assignment? I'm saying she was asked to make decisions I wouldn't have asked a junior officer to make. The defense attorney, Captain Torres, stood for her cross-examination. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that made you lean forward to hear what she had to say. General Reed, you've reviewed the defendant's service record. In your professional opinion, is Captain Reed a competent officer? She's an exceptional officer who was placed in an impossible situation. But she did falsify her after-action report, did she not? I looked at Lindsay again. She was watching me now, her face pale but determined, waiting to see if I would destroy her or save her. Captain Reed adjusted her timeline to make her decisions appear more defensible than they were in real time. She changed the sequence of events to suggest that civilian casualties were unavoidable when they might have been preventable with different tactical choices. Why would an otherwise honest officer do such a thing? Because she was scared, because she made a mistake under pressure and couldn't live with the weight of it, because she's human. Captain Torres consulted her notes. General Reed, in your classified service, have you ever made decisions that resulted in civilian casualties? Yes. Have you ever been tempted to adjust your reports to make those decisions seem more justified? The courtroom was absolutely silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the scratch of the court reporter's pen, the sound of 30 people holding their breath. Every time, I said, the temptation is always there. To make yourself look better, to make the hard choices seem inevitable instead of choices at all. The difference between good officers and great ones isn't that great ones don't make mistakes. It's that they learn to carry the weight of those mistakes without passing it on to someone else. And in your opinion, has Captain Reed learned that lesson? I looked at my sister one more time, at the woman who'd tried to destroy my career out of jealousy and fear, who'd spent years living in the shadow of someone she thought had abandoned her, who'd finally been faced with the same impossible choices I'd been making for a decade and hadn't known how to live with the consequences. I believe she's learning it now. Judge Wells called for a brief recess, then returned with a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom. This court has reviewed all testimony and evidence in the case of United States versus Captain Lindsay Reed. The defendant has pled guilty to the charges of falsifying official documents and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Lindsay stood at attention beside her lawyer. However, this court also recognizes the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case. Captain Reed was asked to make command decisions typically reserved for officers with significantly more field experience. While this does not excuse her subsequent falsification of records, it provides important context for understanding her actions. I held my breath. Captain Reed, you are hereby sentenced to reduction in rank, to first lieutenant forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and a reprimand that will become part of your permanent record. However, you will not face confinement, and you will be eligible for promotion review in 18 months. Relief flooded through me. Not jail. Career damaged, but not destroyed. A chance to rebuild. Additionally, Judge Wells continued, this court wishes to note for the record that the anonymous allegations filed against General Morgan Reed 3 years ago have been thoroughly investigated and found to be completely without merit. General Reed's service record will reflect that these allegations were malicious and unfounded. My name cleared. My reputation restored. The weight I'd been carrying for 3 years finally lifted. As the court was dismissed, I walked toward the exit. My family stayed seated, probably trying to process everything they'd just learned about both their daughters. In the hallway, Lindsay caught up with me. Morgan. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. Thank you. For what? For not destroying me when you had the chance. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not my competitor or my enemy, but my sister. Flawed human learning the same hard lessons I'd been learning for years. You destroyed yourself, I said. I just chose not to help. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is enough. The house felt different when we returned from the courthouse. Same brick walls, same military precision in the way the magazines were stacked, and the coasters were aligned, but the air itself had changed. Like a storm had passed through and rearranged everything that couldn't be seen. My mother moved through the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, preparing dinner for a family that had discovered they didn't know each other as well as they'd thought. My father sat at the kitchen table cleaning his reading glasses, a nervous habit he'd developed since retirement. Lindsay stood by the window, still in her dress uniform, but with her jacket unbuttoned, staring out at the backyard where we used to play as children. Nobody was talking about what had happened in that courtroom. Nobody was talking at all. I excused myself and went upstairs to what used to be my bedroom, now converted to storage, but still holding traces of who I'd been before I learned to disappear. A few books on the shelf, a faded poster from my high school graduation, the small wooden box where I'd once kept letters from friends who'd moved away. I opened the box and found what I was looking for, buried beneath old birthday cards and movie ticket stubs. A manila envelope sealed and marked with classifications that most people would never see. My discharge papers. Not the sanitized version my family had been given, but the real ones. The ones that told the truth about who I'd been and what I'd done. When I came back downstairs, my mother was setting the table with her good china. The kind reserved for special occasions, though I couldn't tell if this qualified as celebration or wake. "Dinner's ready," she announced, though none of us moved toward the dining room. "Actually," I said, "I think we need to talk first." I placed the envelope in the center of the kitchen table between the salt and pepper shakers that had belonged to my grandmother. The classification stamps were visible through the manila official seals and warning labels that spoke a language my family didn't know. "Morgan," my father started, "if that's classified. It's my discharge paperwork. My real discharge paperwork. You have a right to know who your daughter actually is." My mother dried her hands on a dish towel. The same nervous gesture she'd made when we were children, and she had to tell us that one of our pets had died, or that we were moving to a new base. "We know who you are," she said quietly. "No. You know who you were told I was. There's a difference." I opened the envelope and spread the papers across the table. Service record commendations, mission summaries that had been declassified specifically for this moment. 11 years of my life laid out in official language and government letterhead. Lindsay was the first to sit down. She picked up one of the documents, a citation for the Operation Nightfall mission that Colonel Morrison had mentioned in court. Her eyes moved across the page, taking in words like exceptional valor and saved multiple American lives, and recommended for Medal of Honor, declined for operational security. My father sat down next. Then my mother. We gathered around the kitchen table like we were examining evidence, which in a way we were. Psychological evaluation. Exceptionally stable under extreme stress, my mother read aloud. Recommended for continued deep cover operations. Combat leadership assessment, superior tactical judgment, and decision-making capability, and my father added. Natural aptitude for command in hostile environments. They read in silence for several minutes, occasionally passing papers between them, their faces cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been pride. Finally, my father looked up at me. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Simple words that carried the weight of 20 years of misunderstanding. "Because no one asked." "We're your family," my mother said. "We shouldn't have had to ask." You had Lindsay's career to celebrate, her achievements to share with the neighbors, her success to be proud of. I was just the cautionary tale, the one who couldn't hack it. But we didn't know. You didn't want to know. The words came out harder than I'd intended. It was easier to believe I'd failed than to ask why I'd really left. Easier to have one successful daughter and one disappointment than to wonder if maybe you'd misunderstood the story. Lindsay set down the paper she'd been reading. "I'm not successful. Not really. I falsified reports because I couldn't handle the pressure you've been living with for years. You made a mistake. That's different." "Is it?" I looked at my sister, at the woman who'd tried to destroy me because she couldn't stand being compared to a ghost. "Yes. Because you can learn from mistakes. What I did, what we did, that's not about learning. It's about surviving." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the leather bracelet, the one Sarah had made for me in Damascus. I'd worn it every day for 3 years, a reminder of lives saved and lives lost, and the weight of carrying both. I placed it on the table in front of Lindsay. "What is it?" she asked. "A reminder, not a trophy. not proof of anything. Just a reminder that some things matter more than recognition. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands. The leather was soft from wear, the knots simple but strong. Who made it? A little girl I pulled out of a collapsed building. She died 3 weeks later in an unrelated airstrike. Lindsay's face changed. The competitive edge that had defined our relationship for years softened into something more human. I don't want it, she said quietly. I don't deserve it. It's not about deserving. It's about remembering that the weight of command isn't measured in medals or promotions. It's measured in the people who go home to their families, because you made the right choice when it mattered. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It looked different on her than it had on me. Less like a burden, more like a promise. My mother was crying quietly, tears she was trying to hide behind the dish towel she was still holding. I'm sorry, she said. We're all sorry. We should have known. Should have asked. Should have seen. I don't want apologies, I said. I don't want forgiveness. I just wanted you to know who I was, who I am. My father reached across the table and touched my hand. It was the first physical contact we'd had in years that wasn't a formal handshake or obligatory hug. We see you now, he said. It wasn't enough to erase 20 years of invisibility, but it was something. And sometimes, something is where you start. 6 months later, I stood at the front of a nondescript conference room at the National Defense University, looking out at 43 of the military's most promising young officers. The seminar was called Advanced Strategic Decision-Making in Asymmetric Environments, which was Pentagon speak for how to make impossible choices when people's lives depend on getting it right. The students were handpicked from every branch of service, captains and majors who'd shown exceptional promise in field operations, who'd been identified as future leaders who needed to understand that command wasn't just about giving orders, but about carrying the weight of their consequences. In the front row, First Lieutenant Lindsay Reed sat with her notebook open pen, ready, attention focused. She'd requested assignment to the seminar through proper channels, no family connections, no special treatment. Just an officer who'd learned she had gaps in her education and was willing to do the work to fill them. We'd spoken twice since the trial. Brief conversations, careful and formal, two professionals, trying to find their way back to being sisters. The leather bracelet was visible on her wrist, worn now like mine had been, a daily reminder of responsibility. Leadership, I began, is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about having the most experience or the best training or the cleanest service record. Leadership is about making decisions with incomplete information under impossible circumstances, and then living with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of your life. I clicked to the first slide, a satellite image of a city most of them wouldn't recognize. Damascus, though I didn't identify it as such. How many of you have been in a situation where saving one life might cost another, where following orders might compromise your mission, where doing the right thing and doing the legal thing weren't the same thing? Half the hands in the room went up. The experienced half. The ones who'd learned that the gap between classroom theory and field reality was measured in heartbeats and split-second choices. The scenarios I'm going to present today aren't hypothetical. They're based on actual operations, actual decisions made by actual commanders under actual fire. Some of those commanders made the right choices, some made the wrong ones. All of them had to live with the outcomes. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through case studies, stripped of classified details, but retaining their moral complexity. The building collapse in an unnamed city where extracting civilians might compromise ongoing operations. The convoy ambush where calling for air support might save your soldiers but endanger nearby civilians. The intelligence operation where protecting your source might mean letting innocent people die. I didn't give them answers. There weren't any. I gave them frameworks for thinking through problems that had no clean solutions, tools for carrying weight that would never fully leave their shoulders. During the break, a young Marine captain approached me. "Ma'am, the scenario about the humanitarian extraction was that Operation Thresher." I looked at him carefully. "I can't comment on specific classified operations, Captain." "Of course, ma'am. It's just..." My unit was deployed to that region afterward. We heard stories about a team that pulled 22 civilians out of an impossible situation with 0 casualties. He paused. They called the team leader Ghost Mother. "What's your point, Captain?" My point is that some decisions look impossible until someone shows you they're not. That sometimes the right choice is the one that looks crazy until it works. I nodded. And sometimes the right choice is the one that looks crazy and doesn't work. The decision has to be made based on the information available, not the outcome you hope for. When the session resumed, I noticed Lindsay taking more detailed notes. She asked good questions, tactical ones about resource allocation and timing, ethical ones about the weight of command responsibility. She was learning to think like a leader instead of just an officer following protocols. As the seminar concluded, I offered the usual closing remarks about continued education and professional development. But then I deviated from my prepared script. One final thought, I said. Some of you will go on to have careers that get documented in history books. Your decisions will be analyzed in military academies, your strategies will be taught to future generations. You'll have monuments and memorials and Medal of Honor citations. I paused, looking out at faces that were young and eager, and convinced they could change the world. Others of you will make decisions that save lives in ways no one will ever know about. You'll prevent wars that never get reported, stop attacks that never happen, rescue people whose names will never appear in newspapers. Your service will be invisible, your sacrifices unrecognized, your victories classified so deeply that even your families won't know what you accomplished. The room was absolutely silent. Both paths matter. Both paths require courage. But the second path requires something else. The strength to serve without recognition, to sacrifice without applause, to be a hero in ways that no one will ever acknowledge. I clicked to my final slide, a simple black screen with white text. Leadership isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what needs to be done and having the courage to do it, regardless of who's watching. After the session ended, I packed my materials while students filed out discussing case studies and comparing notes. Lindsay lingered until the room was empty. "Good session," she said. "Thank you. That story about the humanitarian extraction. 22 civilians. That was you, wasn't it?" I looked at her, this sister who tried to destroy me and was now trying to learn from me. "Why do you think that?" "Because you told it like someone who'd been there, like someone who still carries it." I finished packing my laptop. The weight of command isn't about the decisions you make, Lindsay. It's about learning to carry those decisions without letting them break you. She nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't 6 months ago. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm proud of you, of who you are, who you've always been." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, it was just recognition, finally, from someone who mattered. I didn't need applause. I didn't need medals or monuments or my name in history books. I just needed air, space to breathe, room to exist without shrinking to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. Walking out of that conference room, I realized I finally had it. If my story reached you, if it reminded you of your own invisible battles and unrecognized sacrifices, I want you to know you're not alone. Drop a note in the comments. Just say, "Listening." You don't have to tell your story, don't have to explain your wounds. Just let me know you're there. It's more than enough. Sometimes knowing someone is listening is the only recognition we need. And sometimes being heard is the same thing as being seen.